here will reconvene as soon as they're ready.
But we
as
need
soon
to
as the
make
Senate
sure-
passes something,
we
and
need
you're
to make
basically
sure
saying,
that-
we don't believe you. You basically
No,
said
look, I'm just saying that
a promise is meaningless.
Jake, I'm just saying that there are negotiations going on. As Ben noted in his questions, there have been some signs that of a willingness to find some bipartisan compromises here on these big remaining issues, but that the president's priority is, this is not a question where 50% is okay, because if you take these two issues, the omnibus and the payroll tax cut, it is not okay just to get one of them. It simply isn't, because that means 160 million Americans are stuck with the bill of congressional inaction. So that's not okay. Leslie.
Jay, we had a story today in McClatchy that parts of the story that President Obama gave in September awarding the Medal of Honor may be untrue, substantiated, or exaggerated according to a lot of military documents we looked at. Does the White House find this a concern, and are you intending to do anything about it, look into whether they had embellished history?
Leslie, the president was very proud to present the Medal of Honor to Sergeant Meyer for his extraordinary service in Afghanistan. As the president said that day, in Sergeant Dakota Meyer, we see the best of a generation that has served through a decade of war. The answer to your question is no. Everyone, even the reporter who wrote yesterday's article, agrees that Sergeant Meyer displayed extraordinary heroism. Indeed, a subsequent article, within, I think, hours, by that same reporter last night, makes it clear that Meyer's comrades feel he deserves the Medal of Honor. President Obama was proud to present it on behalf of a grateful nation.
Any suggestions that there were some problems?
Well, I got a little whiplash reading the two articles that McClatchy put out. One said one thing, the other said the other. What the president believes is exactly what I said, and that this young man is the best of a generation that has served through a decade of war, and he was proud to present him the Medal of Honor. Dan.
Thank you. You keep saying that the pay-for is not the issue, but the president at one point was supporting the insistence on the millionaires' surtax, and then is no longer doing that.
Well, Dan, I think I'll say again, and I encourage you to review the transcripts. I have said from the beginning that we are open to other pay-fors. We supported, but you said we insisted. We supported one version because we think it's fair.
So what changed? Why did he drop that?
I think all but one Republican refused to ask the 300,000 richest Americans, millionaires and billionaires, to pay a little bit more so that 160 million Americans could get a tax cut next year, or not see their taxes go up at the very least. That's what happened. And we believe that that was a fair way to do it, an eminently fair way to do it. But Republicans, almost in lockstep, disagreed. They were willing to say no to a tax cut for 160 million hardworking Americans rather than ask millionaires and billionaires to pay a little bit more. That's their position, and that's a reality. We have said from the beginning that while we supported the Senate Democratic pay-for, and while the president himself put forward a pay-for, that we were open to discussions about alternative ways to fund this payroll tax cut extension and to fund unemployment insurance extension, as long as they were economically responsible and they did not take from the middle class the other, with one hand what we're giving with the other in a payroll tax cut extension. So it should not stick it to the middle class. Those are our principles.
As it stands now, what is the biggest hurdle to getting a deal done?
Well, I want to, reflect the optimism here that some expressed on the Hill this morning, that we believe a deal can get done, and that there's no reason to talk about a government shutdown, because if we need a couple of extra days, I think the American people would expect Congress to pass a short-term continuing resolution to ensure that they had time to get this fundamental piece of business done. There is room for compromise. There are issues that need to be resolved in the spending measure, but they can be resolved. And there are certainly many paths here to getting a payroll tax cut extension done. So, I think that a willingness to be reasonable here would go a long way.
And one other question. Yesterday you guys put something out on a briefing that the president received national security holiday briefing. Is there any known threat out there or anything in particular that the administration is concerned about with the holidays approaching?
No, nothing. I have nothing for you on that. This is about making sure at a moment, at a time of the year like this one, that everyone is following the president's directive here, that we take every measure necessary to ensure the safety and security of the American people, both here and abroad. Yes, sir. Yeah.
You had objections to the defense bill. You've dropped them. There's still a lot of civil liberties experts who are convinced that that bill contains the seed of the future detention of U.S. citizens indeterminately if they're suspected of terrorism. Are you really that convinced that there was a big enough change that you drop an important issue like this?
Well, let me make clear that this was not the preferred approach of this administration. And we made clear that any bill that challenges or constrains the president's critical authorities to collect intelligence, incapacitate dangerous terrorists, and protect the nation would prompt the president's senior advisors to recommend a veto. After intensive engagement by senior administration officials, the administration has succeeded in prompting the authors of the detainee provisions to make several important changes, including the removal of problematic provisions. While we remain concerned about the uncertainty that this law will create for our counterterrorism professionals, the most recent changes give the president additional discretion in determining how the law will be implemented, consistent with our values and the rule of law, which are at the heart of our country's strength. This legislation authorizes critical funding for military personnel overseas, and its passage sends an important signal that Congress supports our efforts as we end the war in Iraq and transition to Afghan lead, while ensuring that our military can meet the challenges of the 21st century. On the provision in particular that you referenced, it does not increase or otherwise change any of our authorities in regard to detention of American citizens. It is simply a restatement of the authorities that were granted to the president in 2001.
Is this just a recognition that ultimately the courts would settle disputes like that?
No, the changes give discretion to the president in the implementation of this law. If as this law is being implemented, the president feels that our counterterrorism professionals are being constrained and that their flexibility is being constrained in a way that does not reflect our values, then he will ask for changes. He will go to the authors of these provisions and ask for legislative changes that are separate from the defense authorization bill. But again, the changes that were made were sufficient to allow senior advisors to withdraw the recommendation of a veto, but we are still concerned about the uncertainty that this law creates. Nora.
When the president spoke in Kansas, he spoke about his deep conviction that everyone pay their fair share. How deep is the president's conviction if he's willing to abandon the surtax on millionaires, or that even the wealthy pay more?
Nora, I know you were here just a few short minutes ago when I answered this question. The issue is not how it gets paid for. The president has his clear preference. He believes, like the majority of the American people, that the 300,000 wealthiest millionaires and billionaires in this country ought to pay a little bit more so that 160 million working Americans can get a payroll tax cut extension.
Now you're
But
saying
you're
it's not important how it's paid for.
no. The priority.
Hold for future pieces of legislation too?
Nora, the
It's not
priority
important how it's
here
paid for?
is making sure that regular folks out there who get a paycheck don't see their taxes go up by an average of $1,000 next year. We have said from the beginning that we are open to different ways of paying for it. We at times marvel at the whiplash caused by the sudden interest in paying for a tax cut among some Republicans who heretofore had insisted that tax cuts not be paid for. That's an interest we share. We think that's the responsible thing to do. But let's be clear here. The only reason why we're having this debate is because the president put it in the American Jobs Act. Extension and expansion of the payroll tax cut. A few short weeks ago, I stood up here and read to you numerous statements by leading Republicans who said they weren't even for a payroll tax cut extension. They were perfectly happy to see 160 million Americans, including, I would assume, a majority of their own constituents, get stuck with a $1,000 tax hike next year, rather than ask millionaires and billionaires to pay a little bit extra. folks who over the past 30 years have done exceptionally well, while the middle class has struggled. So we've come a fair distance here. Republicans now say they want this payroll tax cut extension, that they are interested in seeing middle-class Americans not have their taxes go up. That's progress. What I think is essential here is that the president's priority has not been how it's paid for or raising taxes. It's been lowering taxes for the vast majority of Americans out there.
When the president first proposed his American Jobs Act, with the price tag of over $400 billion, part of that was asking the wealthiest Americans to pay
Yes.
more. Not millionaires, those making over $250,000 a year. Successive parts since it's been broken up of the president's job plan have not passed. Now you're on the payroll tax, and again, that's also in jeopardy. Is the president willing to abandon what has been the embodiment of his core value that he's been speaking about repeatedly, which is that the wealthier pay more and that everybody pay their fair share, so he can get one part, at least one part of his jobs bill passed?
What the president is interested in is making sure that most Americans, most Americans out there who have an income, 160 million Americans who get a paycheck, don't see their taxes go up by $1,000 next year. That's the right position for those Americans, and it's the right position for the American economy. You misstate what the president's priorities here are. We have, in the American Jobs Act, we had an opportunity to put 400,000 teachers back in the classroom. The president believed that the right way to pay for that was asking close some subsidies for corporations, asking the wealthiest to pay more. There were a variety of provisions within our broad American Jobs Act proposal. Republicans rejected that. They've rejected everything that would benefit the economy and the middle class and working Americans when the suggestion is that the wealthiest of us should pay a little bit more to make that happen. Because what's important to remember is the American Jobs Act would not have added a dime to our deficit. The president's very concerned about getting our deficits and debt under control. The issue with the payroll tax cut, an issue that Republicans used to support and now in the last few weeks support again, is that the American people cannot, in this stage of our recovery, or should not, be asked to pay $1,000 on average in taxes extra next year. So the president is very interested, that is his priority, in making sure that doesn't happen and ensuring that Congress does not leave town having protected their own tax breaks and the tax breaks of the wealthiest Americans, but not made sure that the American people didn't have their taxes go up. So that's been his priority here. Yeah, Ed.
You seem, in all this, seem to be downplaying the notion when you say the priority here is not the pay for. You seem to be downplaying the idea that the pay for was important at all, when in fact, when the president went to Congress that very first night in September, he said that this American Jobs Act was paid for and that it's not going to add one dime to the deficit, I think was his phrase.
Yes.
Right? So are you now opening the door to passing this, because it's such a big priority, the payroll tax cut extension, without it being paid for?
We strongly prefer that it be paid for. That's why the president put forward a proposal that it was paid for. That's why he supported the Democratic Senate alternative that had it paid for. And it's certainly, I have not seen any indication at this point that there's disagreement about the need to have it paid for. I think the question that you ask is,
Well, Senator Reid and Durbin have both said this week that you could pass it without it being paid for, citing the fact that Republicans, as you noted, in fairness, have passed this payroll tax cut extension before without paying for it. You've cited Grover
and
Norquist.
generally believe that no tax cut needs to be paid for.
Right. So the door is now open
So,
to pass it without it being paid
Again,
for.
I'm not negotiating, and I had this question, in earlier weeks when we were talking about different ways to pay for the
Well, we're
payroll
at the
tax.
end game now.
No,
Some
and
people-
I'm saying that my answer is the same. I'm not going to negotiate a hypothetical about whether, if that were to
Is the
happen.
door closed? Are you saying under no circumstance? Because the
I'm not
president said it
issuing-
will not add a dime to the deficit. Is that now changed?
Well, his American Jobs Act would not have added a dime to the deficit if Republicans hadn't blocked it, and his proposal for the American Jobs Act, or at least the version that he supported, or rather the payroll tax cut in the Senate that he supported, would not have added a dime to the deficit. I believe that we can, as I've said repeatedly now, that there are alternative ways to pay for this that can be found and compromised on that meet the president's principle that we don't do harm to the economy, we don't stick it to the middle class, the very people we're trying to help in this process. So, how this how this looks at the end is something I cannot foretell at this point. But the President's priorities are clear. He restated them again today.